So it's confession time. The interview you're about to watch is actually the second time I interviewed Mike Duran. I had previously interviewed him about 3 weeks ago, and we had a great interview. And as soon as it was done, I said, "Thanks, Mike, for letting me interview you. I'll let you know when the video is uploaded." We hung up the call, and I realized I had not been recording the video or the audio. So, Mike was gracious enough to do the interview again, and that's what you're about to watch, is us doing a retake on the interview. Despite us technically having the same conversation again, it was a great conversation, and I know you'll enjoy it. I kind of ran onto you on Twitter and then kind of followed that rabbit hole and got to know some of your stuff, read a couple of your books, in particular, a book called Christian Horror,
Mhm.
and really enjoyed that book. Now, this isn't a new topic to me. It's something that for many years I've thought about and maybe rationalized why I
Mhm.
would write horror and why some of the stuff I write bridges on horror.
Right.
But so you're singing to the choir with me, but it's still an interesting topic to talk about. So what I did was I pulled a couple quotes out of your book, and I'm just going to throw them out there and have you kind of riff on them,
Okay.
expound
Sounds
on
good.
them. And here's the first one. One of the most compelling aspects of the horror genre's compatibility with a biblical worldview is the challenge it poses to materialism.
Yeah, that's a big one. In that, whenever there's an appeal to the supernatural, there's a challenge to the materialists. So in and the supernatural is a very common staple of the horror genre, whether it's exorcisms or ghosts
Right.
or I guess paranormal phenomenon like ESP or clairvoyance, remote viewing could be considered as part of a naturalistic world, but there still are elements to which, paranormal phenomenon is outside of the realm of science and it broaches uh, more spiritual or other dimensional areas. So, yeah, I'd say along those lines that whenever there's, for instance, more recently, there's two movies, popular movies with a Christian or a biblical worldview on exorcism. And I'm just talking
Yeah.
of Nefarious and then what was the other one? The Pope's Exorcist with Russell Crowe.
Yes.
And that's allegedly based on a true story. And so the subject of exorcism immediately appeals to or summons this idea of spirits,
Right.
non-physical agencies that can possess a person. Now obviously there's room within the um, exorcism genre to appeal to a naturalistic POV. In other words, for instance, a movie like I don't know if you ever saw the Babadook.
No.
And, yeah, and it's really worth seeing because it has to do with post-birth trauma, you know, and it borderlines throughout the movie. You're unclear whether or not this woman is suffering from a case of a real foreign agent or foreign entity, or whether or not it's psychological. Her trauma is psychological, and
Okay.
so, in other words, some exorcism movies obviously tread upon the idea that this isn't a spirit at all, it's a psychological condition.
Well, what about the serial killer movie? The movie where it's all a physical entity and there's no spiritual, where the horror is materialistic only. So how can you reconcile that with this statement that that horror is challenging materialism?
Well, even even in the simplest sense, Ben, the simplest sense that the serial killer is considered to be evil,
Hmm.
right? He is
Right.
an abnormal personage, but it's an abnormal condition. And so even from that perspective, you're evoking this idea of absolute good and absolute evil. In other words, you know, killing people is at the height of of an immoral, you know, a lifestyle or conduct or whatever action.
Right.
And so you're appealing to um, some kind of absolute that exists that the naturalist still has to explain why it is not good for
Right.
someone to become a serial killer and for those kind of deviancies.
And I
But
can't help but think too, even if the say the storyteller is gonna is going to try to approach it from just materialism, as an audience member, whether or not you really process it, you are having a moral reaction to
mhm,
it.
right.
Um, naturally, you are reacting, and that reaction is coming from somewhere. And that'd be an argument I would have for why we can say biblically there's maybe a suppression of the knowledge of God there or something like
Mhm.
that.
Not to mention it summons the whole idea of human worth that
Hmm.
where does, I mean, human worth and values and the idea of human rights even come from? It's rooted in a Judeo-Christian worldview that
Yeah.
individuals are intrinsically worth something. And from obviously from a scriptural perspective, that has to do with our being created in the image of God. So that is, that's kind of summoned as well. But another
Yeah.
thing to mention, and we've talked about this, and I mentioned this in my book, Christian Horror, is the whole idea between the kind of horror that's evoked from an atheist worldview and the categorically different horror or terror that's evoked from a biblical worldview. And I've used H.P. Lovecraft as an example of this, where Lovecraft is like one of the OGs, the horror OGs. He's like up
Yeah.
at the top, and
Yeah.
his whole Cthulhu mythos and his bestiary of Cthulhu and all the other various creatures are basically they're based on a kind of a Darwinian concept that the universe is cold, it's lifeless, it's uncreated, it's moving towards chaos, and that human beings are just a speck within this universe. And that,
Mm.
from Lovecraft's perspective, the real horror is atheism itself.
Hmm.
The real horror is
Yeah.
that
That you are a
I don't
speck.
we're a speck.
Yeah.
We're a speck in the universe, and there's no cohesive moral fabric to hold us together. We are just spiraling into non-existence, and all of our science, all of our medicine, all of our human, technology, etc., will not allow us to escape Cthulhu or
Yeah.
the monsters that await us. Now, from a biblical perspective, horror the horror from a biblical perspective is that there is there is life after death, and there is moral accountability. There is a moral
Yeah.
reckoning that each one of us must face. And so that's why in the scriptures, there's I was just thinking about that phrase the apostle Paul said, and it's in one of the Corinthians, first or second, where he said, because of the terror of the Lord we persuade men. And that phrase is striking to me, the terror of the Lord, because as evangelicals, as Christians, we love to emphasize the grace of the Lord. And obviously, the scripture says it's the goodness of God that leads us to repentance. But there's also a sense in which the terror of the Lord can do that as well, realizing that the universe, I'm not just going to disappear into nothingness, but my moral actions, my decision, my life matters here, and that I will stand before an infinitely holy God and have to give account. And so that's kind of the point or the distinction that I'd want to make there too, between a materialistic worldview, horror from a materialistic worldview, as opposed to horror from a Christian worldview. They're both diametrically opposed, but each of them have their own terror.
Yeah.
That
Yep.
I mean, for the unbeliever, it's non-existence. Non-existence should scare us. For one thing,
Yeah.
it has moral ramifications on life now. That means that I can do things now and not have to be worried about being morally accountable for them. There's a real
Right.
horror to that notion as well.
I think there's also a horror to that spec concept that you can have the positive side. I get to do whatever I want. Ha! And then you also have the other side of I'll do whatever I want and it doesn't matter. It won't be
Yep.
remembered. It doesn't mean anything. It'll just be gone. And as
Mhm,
self-conscious beings, I think that messes with us badly.
mm,
Um,
mhm,
I would say too, I have read a little bit of H.P. Lovecraft, and it's probably the one time I can clearly remember reading something and being truly disturbed by it. There's some
mhm,
just there's some real darkness in his writing, in that concept of what you're describing, that you are a speck and
mhm.
the great gods of the universe are really monsters, and you will be destroyed and you will be consumed and you will be nothing. um, let
What's
me
you know what you know
Yeah.
what's interesting about that, if I could add too, though, is that there is great energy in the atheist community to try to counter the message of like an H.P. Lovecraft. Not that
Hmm. Yeah.
Lovecraft is a personage that they're constantly after, but the idea that
Right.
all he's done is kind of taken atheism to its or naturalism to its logical conclusion.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
and there's great effort on the part of atheists to say no, 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 our lives are worth something, and that type of
We
thing.
make up the meaning, and yeah, there's lots of attempts to sort of step around it, but it seems like H.P. Lovecraft is being more honest.
Yeah.
Another quote: "Dystopia is an admission of depravity."
I was talking about how the popularity, for one, of the dystopian genre is kind of evergreen in literature right now. I mean, it goes all the way back to some of the post-apocalyptic type of stuff. I remember there was a book out. What was the name of that book? About On the Beach, was it the name of it? It was like came out in the 60s, but it was about nuclear war. And a lot of those things kind of appeal to, a lot of the stories appeal to this post-apocalyptic scenario where everything collapses and men have to, humanity has to learn um, how to survive and stuff. So, and then obviously you get into the newer iterations of it, like the Hunger Games, and even zombie apocalypses are like this. But again, it's this whole idea that it's a contrast between utopianism, humanism, and, gosh, I don't know what you'd say, realism. That there's a humanist manifesto that basically posits that humans are essentially good. They are at the pinnacle of evolution and will continue to evolve. And from that is extrapolated that technology, science, medicine, all of these things will become tools to lead to a better society, um, a better world, a better culture. That appeals to this idea that no, no, there's a fly in the ointment here, and what the fly that's in the utopian ointment is actually the true nature of humanity. And the one of the essential, I mean, one of the foundational teachings in scriptures, is that human beings, though created in the image of God, have fallen. We are intrinsically sinful. Our faculties, our choices, all of our lives are tainted by sin. And you quoted like Romans 1, and Romans 1, 2, and 3 are so foundational to this
Right.
idea that humans know the truth, but we also actively suppress the truth. So we intuitively know what's right, but we instinctively veer towards what is wrong.
And
Our
it's
immor- uh,
interesting when you think of the genre. You kind of listed out at the beginning that it incorporates things like an AI gone bad in Terminator, or zombies. There's lots of different flavors of dystopia,
mhm,
and they all
mhm.
seem to kind of be a way of saying, in this case, nope, nope, can't overcome the wickedness of man or the fallen nature of man. How about in science? Nope, can't overcome it. How about in this? Nope. How about so they're all different, but they all
Hmm.
seem to kind of point to the same thing. Like you say, the fly in the ointment is us. We are the
Hmm.
problem. Okay, let me give you another quote. Amish heroines are just as potentially dangerous as Christian vampires.
Hmm. So I use those archetypes because they're kind of at the extreme end of in Christian publishing.
Mhm.
Christian publishing went through this huge phase where, and I think Amish fiction is still very popular, but Amish fiction was the thing. I mean, when I was
Mhm.
contracted by my first publisher, Charisma House, and I published two books that were supernatural suspense. They labeled them, but they were horror. And they said they had to let me go. They couldn't contract me again unless I wanted to write Amish romance. And I kind of laughed at the end of it. I said, "No, I don't think so." But anyway, that's an illustration of how popular that was. Well, on the other side is the idea of the Christian market's aversion to vampires. This is a much bigger
Mhm.
discussion, but at the
Yeah.
time I was blogging and I was kept floating this idea of why not a Christian vampire story. Um, I ended up pitching an idea for a quote unquote Christian vampire novel, and
Okay. So to
it was
give it
just
what's the pitch? How do you pitch that?
very carefully you pitch that. Well, and pretty much with the knowledge that as soon as you mention vampire, then there's red flags in every Christian,
Right.
publisher's, um, mind. So anyway, that's why I used that idea of contrasting Amish fiction,
Okay.
the Amish milk lady, with the vampire, is that we tend to immediately think the vampire and the vampire archetype is evil, but the Amish lady, I mean, she's so sweet, she's
Mhm.
pure, she's virginal, I mean, she's good.
So give me an example of this Amish heroine going bad or being bad. How would you logically say that? Like what could possibly be wrong with this Amish heroine?
Well, in the larger context, that it's, excuse me, that it's a very big sector of the market in in the evangelical Christian readers' minds.
Mhm.
You'd have to pose that question to them. Why do they think? Why would they think that an Amish character can't have bad morals or a deceptive messaging? In other words, is the idea that purity looks like this and not this. In other words, purity looks like an Amish milkmaid and
Right.
not and not let's say a vampire. I mean,
Right.
what is the distinction there? In other words, some very good people can have some very bad morals or deceptive morals.
The untainted Amish heroine doesn't need Jesus. The
Yeah.
vampire does, right? And even that is sort of a problem when you set up this morally clear, pure character is you are discounting the necessity for Christ's redemption even. I mean, I not necessarily. I'm not saying that's true for anybody who reads Amish fiction or for every
Hmm.
Amish story,
Sure. Right.
but it is a danger that and actually this is true for a lot of Christian genres, even Christian films, you take the darkness and the evil and you have to make it into a gray so you don't because your audience won't watch it, if there's like real badness in it. So
Hmm.
everything all the bad is kind of a gray. What does that do to the redemption? You
Hmm.
don't need as big of a redemption for stealing a cookie.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying, in reality you do, in God's reality you do, but I'm just talking more surface. But in your story, when you've reduced all the bad to something very simplistic, you need a very simplistic redemption to solve
Yeah.
it. And
Yeah.
to me, that's a danger of, well, we just watch the good stuff or we just read the good stuff. It's like,
Yes. Well, it's to me also smacks of kind of potentially of a self righteousness.
yeah.
I was thinking when you were talking, I was thinking of Jesus's parable of the tax collector and the Pharisee, who both go to the
Mm,
temple.
right.
And the Pharisee just has a list of things. I don't do this, I don't do this, I do this, I do this, therefore I'm righteous. And it says the tax collector, I mean, he wouldn't even, come close to the altar. He just stepped back, he stepped away and just beat his breast and said, I'm not worthy. Jesus says, that's the guy that's more
Yeah.
righteous than the other guy that's touting his stuff. And whether we like it or not, there is kind of a self-righteousness that a person can get from saying, I don't read that stuff. I don't watch that stuff. Now, that's not an argument to say we should just watch everything. That's just
Right. Right.
an argument to say that claiming to read only what's pure and good, profanity free, family friendly, etc., that can be a self-righteousness in itself.
Let me give you another quote from Christian horror. The job of the Christian artist is not necessarily to forge their own genre, but to mine existing inroads and expand the paths already walked by others.
Mhm. In relation to horror, for instance, that genre has been, we've kind of relegated it to, that's for the secular mind, that's for people, who are perverse, that's for people who want to watch
Right.
torture porn, that's for people who are into the occult. And as Christians, we've kind of just bailed on it.
Hmm.
And I don't think that's the proper way to approach that or other genres, to just say, hey, this has become just total smut or something I don't like. Therefore, it is unredeemable. Now, obviously, if you're talking about something as blatant as pornography or something like this,
Right.
then yeah, but there are, like within the horror genre, there are so many different subgenres and topics that can be tackled. It's actually much more broad than people think. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like
Yeah,
I've thought,
absolutely.
I'm actually working on a second edition to Christian horror right now, and I made a list of subgenres of the horror
Hmm.
genre, and it's really quite fascinating how many
Philip a
other,
page
yeah, yeah,
or
it's
two.
really interesting. And so I think that as Christians, that's why I think one of the leads, or one of the main points I was trying to make with Christian horror was that as Christians, we need to kind of see past all of the knee jerk reactions to the genre and see that no, there's inroads here for us to reclaim this and use this. I think you might even be seeing that in like the Nefarious film, where I was contacted by a half a dozen people. I still haven't seen Nefarious. I don't know if you have.
I have not seen that one.
Yeah, but I was contacted by quite a few people that says you have to see this. I want your opinion on it. Blah 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 blah. So eventually, I'll get around to seeing it. But it's interesting now that there's a film that's flat out labeled as horror, and a Christian is using that as a springboard for greater discussion. Whether or not the film is good or not, I don't know. I can't say yet, but
Right.
I think that's kind of more what I'm getting at. One of the tags I use for whenever I promo Christian horror is, "Why should the devil have all the good horror?" And obviously,
You you know you're quoting, "Why
yeah,
should the
Larry
devil have all
Norman,
the good music?" Yeah.
yeah, Larry Norman. Why should the devil have all the good music? Well,
Okay.
I'd echo that. Why should the devil have all the good horror?
Yeah.
Especially when targeting him and making fun of him and revealing
Sure.
his tricks and antics isn't part of our methodology in employing horror.
Right. Okay, one more. Redemptive stories look a lot different depending on what side of the redemption one stands.
Yeah. Yeah. Because redemption, I mean, the person who stands outside of redemption is obviously, that's a horrific,
Mhm.
that's a horrific tale, you know. And, you know, I always think about that story of Christopher Hitchens' brother, Peter Hitchens. I don't know if I mentioned this even the last time I was on or not, but Christopher Hitchens was the famed atheist, and Peter Hitchens, his brother, I believe he was like a lapsed Catholic, but he was an atheist at one point too. And he talks about encountering and I always forget this guy's name. It's a very long something van der Weyden. There was a painting called The Final Judgment, or it was something about the last days, and it was a they created altarpieces back then, which were large art pieces. They called them triptychs that were in like three panels and huge panel pieces that would go on an altar in a cathedral. And in this case, there was center stage was a large picture of Jesus Christ sitting on his throne, I think with a scepter, and there were saints around him and angels and heavenly glory around him. And then along the base of the triptych, along the base of the picture, was a parade of horrified souls that were stumbling and bumbling their way past Christ. And Peter Hitchens talked about how when he went in and they viewed that painting, that he was fixated on those characters, not the picture of Christ and the angels in glory,
Mm.
but of this stream of humanity that was running in terror from Jesus. And he rededicated his life to Christ there. It's a great example of how art and imagery can influence us,
Yeah.
positively. But it's also an illustration of the question that you're asking is like on one end of redemption, there are people who will be in heaven. They'll be in a place of peace, a place of wholeness, a place of reunion. But on the other side of redemption, there are people that will be in agony, loss, forever in darkness. And uh, Christian horror, I think, or at least the Christian writer or artist, should be as much about showing that side of redemption
Hmm. Yeah.
as showing the other side of redemption. And I think I just read a quote from Flannery O'Connor, the
Mm.
Southern Gothicist, and
Yeah.
O'Connor more or less said that when you're writing for those who are blind, you have to use big and startling letters. In other words, that you have to go out of your way to compensate their blindness and their
Mm.
dullness. And in a sense, horror does that. Horror is able to slap someone in the face with a visual imagery or a concept that literally scares the hell out of them.
Well, Mike, thank you so much for your time.
My
Um,
pleasure.
we scratched the surface for people that are interested in digging into it more. I highly recommend Mike's book, Christian Horror. And as a bit of promoting that book, Mike, I've told you this in private, but I want to say it on camera too, which is it's a very well researched book. It's interesting how many quotes you have from various sources, Christian and non Christian, discussing horror, what its value is, and applying that to Christian authors and storytellers. So I encourage everybody to read the book. When you're talking about doing a revision of this book, is that what you said you're working on?
Yeah, over that book was published in 2015, so it's got
Okay.
8 years, and I have 8 years under its belt, so to speak, and it has maintained popularity. It's to this
Hmm.
point, it's my best-selling book, which
Okay.
is interesting for me. But so I figured that, well, it's got some interest out there, and over the years, I've just collected so much more material. So I'm looking at the revised version will probably be twice as big. I'm
Okay.
going to have to publish it as a new book. I've got a new cover coming, and so I'm looking towards maybe the end of summer to have this done. But I've got just a boatload of material, so I'm really looking forward to it. I've had fun with this subject. It's obviously one people like to talk about and think about, and I've met a lot of neat people too in the process. So
We'll be looking for that. I definitely will. I enjoyed the first one so much that I will be intrigued to read a book that's updated with new content. And thank you so much, Mike, for your time.
appreciate it, Ben.